In 2009, a partial declassification of Soviet-era transport archives released several hundred files that the Ministry of River Fleet had flagged for destruction in 1991, but never managed to burn. Most of them were routine: cargo manifests, fuel consumption records, maintenance logs for vessels that had long since been scrapped. But one file, bearing the designation -83 and stamped with a classification priority that had no business appearing on a civilian river transport document, described something that cargo manifests do not typically contain. The file described a biological specimen. It described a recovery operation conducted under military supervision on the Lena River, approximately 40 kilometers north of Yakutsk, in November of 1983, and it described the specimen as alive at the time of extraction. The organism, according to the report filed by the captain of the supply barge, RB 1146, had been found frozen into a forming sheet of river ice during an extreme, early-season cold snap. Temperatures that official weather records confirm dropped to -58 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed human skin in under 2 minutes. It had dark hair, fanned out in the ice as if suspended in the moment of submersion. It had gray-white skin that 3 crew members interviewed separately described using the same word: dead-looking. And it had hands pressed flat against the underside of the ice with fingers that the report describes, in language that is clinical and precise and entirely inadequate, as webbed and clawed. Its eyes were open. What the file does not explain, what no document in the Soviet archive has ever explained, is why a civilian river incident was classified at a level normally reserved for nuclear materials, why the recovery team arrived faster than any military unit in the region had ever responded to a non-combat emergency, and why the geographic designation stamped on the file refers not to Yakutsk, where the incident occurred, but to a location 4,000 kilometers downriver, at the point where the Lena River empties into the Arctic Ocean. To understand how that file came to exist, we need to go back to the last navigable week on the Lena River in 1983, and to a 61-year-old captain named Grigory Tarasovich Volkov. The Lena River is one of the great waterways of the world, 4,400 kilometers from its source near Lake Baikal to the point where it fans out into a vast delta and empties into the Laptev Sea above the Arctic Circle. For 7 months of the year, from October through April, the Lena is frozen solid, a highway of ice connecting dozens of settlements too remote for road access, communities that exist only because the river connects them to the rest of civilization during the brief summer navigation season. For those 5 navigable months, supply barges carry everything: fuel, food, building materials, medical equipment, machine parts, winter provisions. When the barges stop running, the settlements are alone until spring. Grigory Volkov had been running those barges for 34 years. His service record with the Yakutsk River Fleet Administration, included in the classified file as Exhibit B, describes a captain of exceptional experience and temperament, methodical, unhurried, with a judgment about ice conditions that his supervisors characterized in annual reviews as bordering on intuitive. He was known, above all, for running later into freeze-up than any other captain in the fleet, pushing into deteriorating conditions to make deliveries that other crews had already abandoned for the season. His crew called him Dedushka, grandfather, though according to every available account, never within his hearing. According to the barge's navigation journal, included in the classified file as Exhibit D, the RB 1146 departed the commercial river port at Yakutsk on November 19, 1983, carrying a standard resupply load for the settlement of Yakutsk, 600 kilometers downriver. The vessel was a Type 812 steel-hulled supply barge, Soviet-built in 1971, 82 meters in length, with a loaded draft of 2.4 meters, a flat-bottomed workhorse designed for exactly this kind of river freight. The weather log for that departure notes air temperature at -31 degrees Celsius, wind from the northwest at 12 kilometers per hour, barometric pressure falling, but within acceptable limits. Cold, but within the range that experienced river crews considered operational. The sky, according to the log, was overcast with a low stratus ceiling, the featureless gray that characterizes Yakutsk in November, when the sun rises for fewer than 5 hours a day, and the light it provides barely qualifies as twilight. Nothing in the departure conditions suggested this run would differ from the dozens Volkov had completed before it. What no one on the river anticipated, what no meteorological station in the region predicted, was the severity of the cold snap that descended on the morning of November 20th. The Yakutsk Meteorological Station recorded a temperature drop of 27 degrees in 14 hours, from -31 to -58, an early season plunge that the station's own records described as unprecedented for November. To place that in context, -58 degrees Celsius is a temperature at which diesel fuel begins to gel in the tank, at which steel becomes brittle enough to crack under stress, at which a cup of boiling water thrown into the air will freeze into a cloud of ice crystals before it hits the ground. Yakutsk sits in the coldest permanently inhabited region on Earth. The nearby settlement of Oymyakon holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded in the Northern Hemisphere at -71.2 degrees, and even by its standards, this was extreme. This was the kind of cold that arrives without warning and reshapes the physical world overnight. The Lena began to freeze with a speed that none of the crew had ever witnessed. According to Volkov's deposition, given to a Ministry of River Fleet investigator in Yakutsk 4 days after the incident, and notable throughout for its precision and absolute absence of emotional language, the crew first noticed the change in ice conditions at approximately 0600 on November 20th, roughly 12 hours into their downriver run. The river surface, which had been running with loose drift ice and occasional pan ice when they departed, was consolidating rapidly. Sheets of new ice were forming between the larger floes, knitting together across open water in a process that Volkov's deposition describes as occurring faster than I have observed in 34 years on this river. The water between the ice sheets was black and still, as if the cold had reached into the current itself and stopped it. By 0900, the RB-1146 was pushing through continuous ice cover, the steel hull grinding against sheets that had not existed 3 hours earlier. The sound of it, according to deckhand Semenov's debriefing statement, was constant, a low, grinding vibration that traveled through the hull and into the bones of every man standing on the deck plates. Volkov made the decision to abort the run at 10:30. The navigation journal records the entry in his handwriting, steady and unhurried even in deteriorating conditions. Ice consolidation exceeding safe operational parameters. Returning to Yakutsk. Zhigansk delivery postponed to spring. A pragmatic decision made without drama, characteristic of a man who had survived 34 years on one of the most unforgiving rivers on Earth by knowing precisely when to push forward and when to turn back. But the river had already closed the window. During the turn, a wide, slow maneuver required to reverse a loaded barge against a freezing current. The vessel swinging in a half-kilometer arc, the port bow of the RB-1146 struck a pressure ridge that had formed along the eastern bank. The impact was not severe, but the barge's bow section became lodged in a mass of consolidated ice that had built up in the slack water near a river bend, where the current slowed and the cold worked fastest. The vessel was stuck. Not critically, the crew had dealt with ice entrapment before, and the hull was intact, but firmly enough that the engine alone could not break the barge free, and the ice was consolidating around the hull with every passing minute. Volkov ordered the crew to deploy manual ice saws and begin cutting a channel around the bow. He estimated, based on the rate of consolidation, that they had 4 to 6 hours before the ice locked the hull permanently. The temperature at the time of the entrapment was -54 degrees Celsius. The crew worked in 5-minute rotations on the ice. The maximum duration exposed skin could remain uncovered before frostbite began. then retreated to the wheelhouse, where a single electric heater maintained what Volkov's deposition dryly notes was an interior temperature of approximately -12. The barge's floodlights, mounted on brackets above the wheelhouse, illuminated a corridor of forming ice ahead, and to port, the halogen beams catching crystals that hung motionless in the air itself. Moisture from the crew's breath, from the ice saw work, from the river's surface, all frozen into a luminous mist that the deposition describes as giving the appearance that the air had solidified. Beyond the reach of the floodlights, the darkness was absolute. It was the engineer, a man identified in the classified file only as Petrov, VN, who saw it first. According to the deposition, Petrov had been positioned on the starboard side of the bow during a break in the ice-cutting rotation, using a handheld inspection lamp to check the hull plates for pressure damage. He called out to Volkov on the forward deck. The deposition records Petrov's words without commentary. "Captain, there is something in the ice." The navigation journal contains a single entry at 14:23 hours, written in Volkov's hand. It reads, "Stop. Contact. Not fish." 3 words that the ministry investigator flagged with a margin note describing them as uncharacteristically terse for this captain, suggesting elevated concern. The journal had been updated on average every 30 minutes for the duration of the voyage, in entries ranging from 12 to 40 words each. This entry was 3 words, and it was the last entry Volkov would make for over 4 hours. What Petrov had found, pressed against the starboard hull in a section of newly formed clear ice, the transparent kind that forms when water freezes fast and clean without trapping air, was a form. Volkov's deposition describes it with the same measured precision he applies to ice conditions and fuel consumption, and the effect of that restraint is more disturbing than any dramatic language could achieve. The form was approximately 180 centimeters in length. The upper portion appeared humanoid in its general proportions: a torso, arms, a head with dark hair that was fanned out in the ice as if the freezing had captured it mid-movement, the strands suspended in all directions like a photograph of something caught by a wave. The skin was gray-white, the color, Volkov notes, of something that has spent its existence without exposure to sunlight, and it was smooth in a way the report acknowledges seemed wrong, though Volkov characteristically declines to elaborate on the nature of the wrongness. The hands were pressed flat against the underside of the ice surface, palms facing upward, fingers splayed, as if the form had been reaching toward the air when the freezing overtook it. The fingers were too long. Every crew member who observed them, and every debriefing statement in the classified file, independently notes this detail. The fingers were longer than those of a human hand by at least a third. The webbing between them extended nearly to the final knuckle, a continuous membrane that Deccan Semenov's statement compares to the foot of a water bird, though thicker and slightly translucent, where the floodlight passed through the ice and illuminated it from above. They ended not in fingernails, but in curved, dark points that Volkov's deposition describes as consistent in form with claws, dark in coloration, approximately 1 centimeter in length, curving inward. The lower portion of the form was not human. No crew member's account attempts to describe it as human. Volkov's deposition records it as a single continuous lower extremity, tapered, without joint or knee-like segmentation, resembling in its general form the body of a large eel or serpent, approximately equal in length to the upper torso. Surface of this lower section was slightly different in coloration from the upper torso, darker, with what Petrov's debriefing describes as a faint pattern, not scales exactly, but something closer to the skin of a shark, visible only where the inspection lamp caught it at a low angle. And then, in a detail that appears in every crew member's account without exception, Volkov notes that the lower extremity divided into 2 distinct terminal sections near its end, each tapering to a point, and each bearing what appeared to be a thin, ragged, semi-translucent fin, a tail that split into 2. The crew's initial reaction, documented in the debriefings and consistent across all 5 statements, was to interpret the form as a drowning victim trapped during freeze-up. The Lena claims lives every year, and a body in the ice, while grim, was a known possibility. 3 men on the crew had encountered recovered drowning victims before, but that interpretation lasted less than a minute, because the lower body was not a pair of legs, and the hands were not human hands. And then Petrov reported the 3rd detail, the one that the deposition records in a single flat sentence, and the one that the 2007 interview returns to 3 separate times across 47 minutes, as if Volkov still cannot bring himself to move past it after 24 years. The form's eyes were open. They were entirely black, not dark brown that appears black in poor light, not dilated pupils and low visibility, but uniformly, completely black from edge to edge, without iris, without sclera, without any feature that Volkov's deposition is able to identify as part of a normal eye. And they were moving. In the 2007 interview, conducted by a Russian investigative journalist named Anatoly Medvedev, recorded in Volkov's apartment in Yakutsk, and published briefly in a newspaper with a circulation of fewer than 8,000 readers before being removed from the paper's website, Volkov describes the moment he understood the form was alive. He pauses on the recording. The journalist's notes indicate the silence lasted 11 seconds. Then Volkov speaks. Petrov told me the eyes were following him. I told Petrov that was impossible, that ice distorts what is behind it, that light refracts, that the cold was affecting his perception. I said everything a rational man would say. Then I looked myself. Another pause, and the eyes moved. They moved from where Petrov was standing to where I was standing. They tracked me, the way a predator tracks movement, not curious, not frightened, patient. He paused a 3rd time. Dead men do not watch you through ice. The deposition is characteristically more restrained. It notes that engineer Petrov reported apparent ocular movement in the specimen at approximately 14:25 hours. That Captain Volkov personally confirmed the observation from the starboard deck rail at a distance of 2 meters, and that the eyes appeared responsive to lateral movement along the deck. It records these details with the same flat authority Volkov applies to weather data. The navigation journal contains no entries between 14:23 and 18:47, a gap of 4 hours and 24 minutes in a log maintained every 30 minutes, without exception for the preceding 36 hours. Volkov's deposition accounts for the gap by noting that the crew ceased ice-cutting operations and assembled on the starboard deck to observe the form. He does not explain why he stopped writing in the log. According to Semyonov's debriefing, the most detailed of the 5 crew statements, and the one that includes observations Volkov's more disciplined account omits, the form did not significantly move during the 4 hours of observation, with one exception. The hands shifted, not dramatically, not a lunge, not a clawing motion, but a slow, almost imperceptible redistribution of pressure against the underside of the ice, as if the form were testing the surface from below. Semyonov's statement notes that the movement occurred over approximately 40 seconds and was visible only because Petrov had repositioned his inspection lamp to illuminate the hands directly. The webbed fingers extended slightly, the clawed tips pressing into the ice with enough force to produce hairline fractures visible in the lamplight. Then the fingers curled inward, then extended again. Then the form was still. Semyonov's statement contains an additional detail that appears in no other document in the file. The clear ice surrounding the form was not consolidating at the same rate as the rest of the river surface. New ice was building across the river in a manner consistent with the temperature, thickening by several centimeters per hour, but the section immediately surrounding the form maintained a thin, transparent quality, as if the ice were being prevented from fully consolidating. He describes it as appearing as if the ice did not want to close around it, though he qualifies this as my impression, not a measurement. Whether the form was generating enough residual body heat to slow the freezing process, or whether some other mechanism was at work, is a question the classified file does not address. Volkov radioed the Yakutsk River Fleet Dispatch Office at 1440 hours. The radio log, included in the file as Exhibit F, preserves the transmission verbatim. RB 1146 to Yakutsk Dispatch. Position 62.14 north, 129.87 east. Vessel ice-locked, requesting assistance. Additionally, reporting unidentified biological specimen, apparently viable, observed in new ice along starboard hull. Request guidance. The dispatch officer's response is also preserved. RB 1146 acknowledged. Maintain position. Do not attempt specimen contact. Do not attempt specimen extraction. Military transport has been dispatched. Dispatch out. No follow-up questions. No request for clarification on the word specimen. No expression of surprise. The exchange lasted less than 90 seconds. Volkov would later observe, in the 2007 interview, that the nature of that response told him more than the response itself. I reported finding an unknown living organism frozen in the Lena River, he said, and the dispatcher did not ask me a single question. Not what it looked like, not how large it was, not whether it posed a danger to the crew. He told me military transport had been dispatched. In the present tense, has been, not will be, as if the call had already been made before I made mine. The military convoy arrived at 20:30, 6 hours after Volkov's transmission. The 2007 interview expands on why that time matters. The nearest military installation is in Yakutsk itself, 40 kilometers to the south. In those temperatures on that road, a vehicle column, and it was a column. 2 heavy flatbed transports, a command vehicle, a portable generator on a trailer, and specialized cutting equipment that I did not recognize should have taken 12 hours at minimum to assemble, load, and reach our position. They did it in 6. He paused, which means they did not assemble in response to my call. They were already assembled. The vehicles were loaded. The team was ready. All they needed was the coordinates. The classified file contains the military transport order. Stamped with a priority designation, the 2009 declassification reviewers noted, was typically reserved for nuclear materials handling. The order authorizes dispatch of a mechanized recovery unit to coordinate 62.14N, 129.87E, with instructions for recovery and secure transport of biological specimen, frozen, classification priority. The order was signed at 14:55 hours, 15 minutes after Volkov's call. 15 minutes to authorize an operation carrying nuclear equivalent classification for a report from a river barge captain about a frozen animal. What occurred between 20:30, when the convoy reached the eastern riverbank nearest the barge, and approximately 0200 on November 21st, when the operation concluded, is documented only through the crew's debriefing statements. No military operation log appears in the -83 file. If one exists, it was filed elsewhere. Volkov's deposition states that approximately 12 military personnel, wearing winter field uniforms bearing no visible unit insignia or rank markings, established a working perimeter on the bank adjacent to the starboard hull. They deployed portable floodlights powered by a generator that Volkov's deposition notes was military specification, significantly more powerful than any civilian equipment I have encountered in river fleet service. The crew was ordered below deck. Volkov protested. Standard protocol required the captain's presence during any hull-adjacent operation, and his protest was noted by the civilian official accompanying the convoy and denied. Through the porthole of the forward crew quarters, according to Samyonov's debriefing, the military team could be observed working on the ice beside the hull under floodlight conditions that turned the surrounding darkness into a small, bright theater. They used powered cutting tools, not manual ice saws, but equipment that produced a high, thin whine and moved through river ice at a rate Semyonov describes as purpose-built. The section they cut was approximately 3 meters by 2 meters and roughly half a meter in depth, large enough to contain the entire form with an undisturbed margin of ice on all sides. Semyonov describes watching the section lifted by a vehicle-mounted crane attached to one of the flatbed transports, swinging through the floodlit air, the form visible within it, dark hair, pale torso, the tail curving along the bottom of the ice block, the hands still pressed flat, the black eyes catching the light from the floods as the block rotated. He describes the ice being lowered onto the flatbed and covered with a heavy tarpaulin. He describes the team working in near total silence, communicating through hand signals and written cards rather than speech. The convoy departed at approximately 0200. It drove north, not south toward Yakutsk, north downriver, along the winter road that follows the frozen Lena toward the lower river settlements and beyond them the Arctic coast. This direction is noted independently in both Volkov's and Sanjunev's statements, and it is a detail that will matter more than any of them understood at the time. By 0400, the crew was assembled in the mess compartment. Each man was interviewed separately by the civilian official, an individual who provided no name and whose ministry credential bore a department designation Volkov did not recognize. The interviews lasted between 40 minutes and 2 hours. Each man signed a non-disclosure agreement under Article 75 of the State Secrets Act, carrying penalties of 5 to 15 years in a corrective labor facility. Each man was told the same thing. The incident involved a deceased indigenous person recovered for forensic identification, a drowning victim, a body from the river recovered by military personnel because civilian resources were inadequate for the temperature conditions. Volkov's deposition states that he accepted the explanation. The 2007 interview revisits it. They told us it was a body, he said, a drowning victim, a native person from one of the settlements. I signed the paper and I went home because in 1983, in the Soviet Union, you accepted what they told you and you did not ask questions about things that arrived in the night with 12 soldiers and no insignia. He took a breath that is audible on the recording. But a drowning victim does not have a tail that forks into two. A drowning victim does not have webbed hands ending in claws. A drowning victim does not have eyes that are black from edge to edge. His voice flattened. And a drowning victim does not watch you through ice. The 3 photographs taken by engineer Petrov on his personal Zenit E camera, 2 showing ice conditions around the hull, 1 showing a dark shape beneath a clear section of ice, are referenced in the file's evidence log as exhibits G1 through G3. The negatives were confiscated during the debriefing interviews. Whether they survive in a military archive or destroyed, or sit forgotten in a storage facility somewhere in the post-Soviet bureaucracy has never been determined. They represent the only known photographic record of what the crew found that day. No one outside the Soviet military apparatus has ever seen them. What the investigation failed to explain, what the classified file does not even attempt to address, is the geographic discrepancy embedded in the file's own designation. Every classified Soviet transport file was assigned a location code corresponding to the incident site. The location code in -83 does not correspond to the coordinates where the barge was trapped, 40 kilometers north of Yakutsk. It corresponds to a point over 4,000 kilometers downriver. It corresponds to the Lena Delta, where the river empties into the Laptev Sea and the Arctic Ocean. The ministry investigator noticed the discrepancy. His margin note reads, "Location code appears erroneous. Incident site is Yakutsk region, not Delta. Recommend correction." The correction was never made because it was not an error. The convoy drove north. The file was coded to the Delta. Whatever they extracted from the Lena River ice was not being cataloged as a local anomaly near Yakutsk. It was being filed under coordinates at the river's Arctic terminus. 4,000 kilometers away, as if the military already understood that what the crew had found was not limited to a single point on the river, but belonged to a corridor that stretched from the frozen interior of Siberia to the sea. Those delta coordinates, the ones the investigator dismissed as a clerical mistake, would appear again 13 years later in an entirely different kind of file. In August 1996, a joint Russian-Norwegian hydrographic survey vessel operating at the precise location encoded in the -83 designation would record 14 minutes of sonar data and capture 12 minutes of underwater footage, showing a biological form whose dimensions, locomotion, and physical characteristics matched Volkov's deposition in every detail that the footage's resolution permitted. And aboard that vessel, serving as the Russian government's liaison officer, was a man named Sergei Maltsev, a former Soviet Navy acoustic analyst who, 12 years earlier, had been assigned to process and catalog the classified -83 file. He recognized the sonar profile instantly. He had seen it before. The file was supposed to be destroyed in 1991. It survived because it was misfiled among fuel consumption records that no one thought worth burning. Grigory Volkov survived too, long enough to speak once, in 2007, in a small apartment in Yakutsk, to a journalist who had found the -83 designation buried in the footnote of a declassified naval logistics document. Volkov was 85. He had been silent for 24 years. He spoke for 47 minutes. The interview appeared in a newspaper with fewer than 8,000 readers. It was removed from the paper's website within a week. Volkov died in 2011. His daughter wrote to the journalist in 2013 that her father had never spoken to the family about November 1983, but that he had kept one item in his bedside drawer for 28 years, a hand-drawn map of the Lena River, with 2 points marked in pencil. One point was 40 kilometers north of Yakutsk. The other was at the river's mouth, 4,000 kilometers to the north, where the Lena empties into the Arctic. He had drawn a line between them, and beneath the line, in his careful, unhurried hand, he had written a single word. It means path. The coordinates embedded in the -83 file, the ones the ministry investigator dismissed as a clerical error, correspond to a point in the Laptev Sea where the Lena River, after 4,400 kilometers of cutting through the Siberian interior, finally reaches the Arctic Ocean. The Lena Delta is one of the largest river deltas on Earth, a vast labyrinth of shallow channels, sandbars, and sediment flats spreading across nearly 30,000 square kilometers where fresh water meets the Arctic. Even in August, at the height of the brief Arctic summer, sea ice persists in the Laptev Sea, drifting in gray-white flows through water so thick with river sediment that visibility below the surface drops to near zero within a few meters. It is not a place that invites exploration. It is a place where things disappear. In August 1996, a joint Russian-Norwegian hydrographic survey was conducting bathymetric mapping of the delta's shallow continental shelf, routine scientific work, funded jointly by the Norwegian Polar Institute and the Russian Academy of Sciences aboard the research vessel Akademik Lavrov. The survey's stated objective, documented in the project charter filed with both institutions, was to map sediment distribution patterns and water column characteristics at the freshwater-saltwater boundary. The project had been approved 18 months earlier. The Akademik Lavrov had been assigned to it through standard Russian Academy channels. And the survey's chief scientist and project director was Dr. Erik Lindgren, a 48-year-old Norwegian physical oceanographer who had led 7 previous Arctic research missions, published 43 peer-reviewed papers, and built a career on the foundational principle that the ocean, however vast, was a system that could be measured, mapped, and understood. What the sonar recorded on August 14, 1996, at coordinates that matched the geographic designation in the -83 file to within 400 meters, would dismantle that principle in 14 minutes. The Akademik Lavrov was a vessel built for this kind of work. A Soviet-era research ship, 78 meters in length, with a reinforced ice-class hull painted white with orange superstructure markings, equipped with multi-beam sonar, water sampling arrays, and a tethered underwater camera system capable of operating at depths up to 200 meters. The ship's complement for the 1996 survey included 12 Russian crew, 6 Russian scientists, 4 Norwegian scientists including Lindgren, and 1 individual whose presence on a civilian hydrographic survey has never been satisfactorily explained. Sergei Ivanovich Maltsev was listed on the crew manifest as Russian government liaison officer, a title that, according to Dr. Lindgren's personal notes, no one on the scientific staff had encountered on a joint research mission before. Maltsev was 53 years old in 1996, a former Soviet Navy acoustic analyst who had transitioned to a civilian advisory role after the collapse of the Soviet Union. His official function aboard the Akademik Lavrov was described in the project documentation as ensuring compliance with Russian Federation regulations regarding hydrographic data collection in territorial waters. In practice, according to Lindgren's notes, Maltsev spent most of the survey's first 11 days on the bridge, observing the sonar displays with an attentiveness that struck the Norwegian team as disproportionate to a bureaucratic oversight role. He asked no scientific questions. He offered no regulatory guidance. He watched the sonar. Lindgren noted in the private letter he would write to his wife on the night of August 14th that Maltsev behaves less like an administrator and more like a man who is waiting for something specific to appear on the screen. That letter was never sent. It was found in Lindgren's personal papers after his death in 2018. Still sealed, the envelope addressed to his wife at their home in Bergen, but never stamped. On August 14th, the Akademik Lavrov was positioned in a navigable channel between drifting ice flows, approximately 18 kilometers northeast of the main Lena Delta outflow, conducting a routine sonar transect at reduced speed. The ship's scientific data log, included in the classified Russian Academy filing as Exhibit A, records the conditions: air temperature 2 degrees Celsius, water temperature 1.4 degrees at the surface and 0.3 degrees at 12 meters depth. Wind from the north at 8 knots. Visibility limited to 400 meters by persistent Arctic fog. The water beneath the hull was 12 meters deep, murky with Lena River sediment, and according to the ship's instruments, barely above the freezing point of salt water. The sonar operator on duty was a Russian technician named Konstantin Belov, a man with 14 years of experience reading multi-beam returns in Arctic waters. At 11:34 hours local time, Belov flagged an anomalous return on the sonar display. The scientific data log records his annotation: single biological return, bearing 047, range 220 meters, depth 9 meters, estimated length 1.8 to 2.2 meters, moving east-northeast at approximately 2 knots. Locomotion pattern unclassified. In 14 years of reading Arctic sonar, Belov had cataloged returns from belugas, walruses, bearded seals, narwhals, and, on one occasion that became a minor anecdote in Russian, oceanographic circles, a lost Pacific walrus 600 kilometers from its expected range. He knew what Arctic marine mammals looked like on sonar. This was not one. The return showed a single elongated form moving beneath the underside of an ice shelf at a depth of 9 meters with a locomotion, pattern that the data log describes as continuous lateral undulation, inconsistent with any cataloged Arctic pinnip or cetacean. Marine mammals in Arctic waters move with a characteristic vertical oscillation. They dive, they surface, they breathe. Their sonar profiles show regular depth changes corresponding to respiration cycles. This form maintained a constant depth, moving horizontally beneath the ice, with a motion that Belov's annotation describes as serpentine. Dr. Lindgren was called to the sonar station at 11:36. According to the data log, which Lindgren annotated in his own hand alongside the Russian entries, the form was tracked for 14 continuous minutes as it moved along the underside of the ice shelf, maintaining a depth between 8 and 11 meters and a speed between 1.5 and 2.5 knots. Its heading was consistent, east-northeast, parallel to the ice edge, moving toward the open water of the Laptev Sea. Lindgren's annotations are clinical for the first 7 minutes. Bearing, range, speed, depth, estimated dimensions. At the 8-minute mark, his annotations shift. He writes, "Form appears to have anterior appendages, paired lateral extensions visible on return, forward of center mass. Not consistent with cetacean pectoral fins. Not consistent with pinniped flippers. Appear articulated. At the 11-minute mark, form has altered heading twice in response to vessel noise, demonstrating awareness of our position. This is not passive drift or current following behavior." At the 13-minute mark, the final annotation before the sonar contact was lost. "I do not know what this is." The form disappeared from sonar at 11:48 hours, 14 minutes after initial detection, moving beyond the effective range of the ship's multi-beam array as it continued east-northeast into the deeper water of the Laptev Sea. Dr. Lindgren ordered the deployment of the tethered underwater camera. The camera system aboard the Academic Lavrov was a standard Russian oceanographic instrument, a pressure-rated housing containing a video camera with integrated floodlight, connected to the ship by a steel-braided cable that served as both tether and data line, with a backup recording unit housed in the camera body itself. The system was designed for benthic surveys, filming the seafloor, not for tracking mobile biological contacts in open water. But it was what the vessel had. The camera was deployed at 11:53 hours, 5 minutes after the sonar contact was lost, at the coordinates where the form had last been detected. It descended into water that the data log describes as having a visibility of less than 2 meters due to suspended Lena River sediment, a thick brown-green murk that the camera's floodlight could barely penetrate. For the first 9 minutes and 21 seconds, the footage, later recovered from the camera's onboard recording unit after the tether was severed, shows nothing but sediment particles drifting through the floodlight beam. Murk and suspended silt swirling in slow currents, occasionally punctuated by what the Norwegian Polar Institute's preliminary analysis identifies as fragments of organic detritus, river material carried north by the Lena's discharge. The camera descended slowly, reaching a depth of 15 meters by the 6-minute mark, hovering in water so opaque that the floodlight illuminated a sphere of visibility approximately 3 meters in diameter. Beyond that sphere, nothing. The footage was being transmitted to a monitor on the Academic Lavrov's bridge in real time, where Lindgren, Belov, the Russian chief scientist, and as Lindgren's notes record, Maltsev, who had appeared on the bridge within seconds of the camera deployment order, were watching. At the 9-minute, 22-second mark, something enters the camera's field of view from the left. The Norwegian Polar Institute's preliminary visual analysis, conducted in Oslo 3 weeks after the survey and included in a report that was subsequently withdrawn at the request of the Russian co-sponsors, describes what the footage shows in measured technical language. A form, pale in coloration, passes the camera at an estimated distance of 2.5 meters, moving from left to right at approximately the same depth as the camera. The form is elongated, approximately 2 meters in length, based on the camera's calibrated field of view. The upper portion displays what the analysis describes as bilateral anterior appendages inconsistent with any known cetacean or pinniped morphology. Limbs, in plain language, that are not flippers and are not fins, but that appear to terminate in structures. The report can only describe manual digits with intradigital membrane. Hands. Webbed hands. The resolution is poor. The sediment-choked water reduces the image to a gray-white shape moving through brown-green murk. But the preliminary analysis identifies several features with varying degrees of confidence. The upper torso, rated as high confidence, appears to be that of a humanoid female, pale, with dark filamentous material trailing from the head region. Hair, the report acknowledges, though it declines to state this with certainty. The lower body, rated as moderate confidence, tapers into a single elongated appendage that undulates laterally. The same serpentine locomotion the sonar had tracked. The terminal portion of the lower body, visible for approximately 2 seconds as the form moves through the camera's field of view, appears to divide into 2 distinct sections. The eyes, visible in a single frame as the form passes closest to the camera, are described by the analysis as uniformly dark, lacking visible sclera or iris differentiation. Black eyes. The same eyes Grigory Volkov had described in a deposition filed in Yakutsk 13 years earlier. It was at this moment, according to Lindgren's personal notes, that Sergei Maltsev spoke for the first time during the camera deployment. He spoke in Russian, which Lindgren understood, but which the recording equipment on the bridge did not transcribe. Lindgren's notes record the translation. I have seen this before. Not the animal. The file. I have read this file. Then, according to Lindgren, he said a word, a designation. 83. The footage continued for 3 minutes and 19 seconds after the initial sighting. The form circled the camera twice at a range of approximately 3 to 5 meters, visible only in fragments through the sediment, a flash of pale skin, the trailing dark hair, the undulating lower body passing through the floodlight beam. At the 11-minute, 41-second mark, the form approaches the camera from below, rising from beneath the floodlight's downward cone. The footage shows the underside of the form ascending toward the camera housing, the pale torso, the webbed hands extended forward, the black eyes oriented directly at the lens. The hands make contact with the camera housing. The image shakes. At 12 minutes and 41 seconds, the footage cuts to black. The steel-braided cable, rated for a working load of 800 kilograms, was severed cleanly at a depth of 19 meters. The cut, examined by the ship's engineer and documented in the data log, was not a break consistent with tensile overload, which would produce frayed, elongated wire ends. The cable had been cut, sliced through at an angle, with the individual steel braids separated cleanly, as if by something extremely sharp applied with significant force. The camera housing, still attached to the lower portion of the cable, sank to the bottom. The crew recovered it 4 hours later using a grapple, and the onboard recording unit, which had continued to record after the tether was severed, was intact. It contained 12 minutes and 41 seconds of footage, the final frame showing nothing but the murky water column as the camera descended to the seafloor after being cut free. What happened on the bridge of the Akademik Lavrov in the hours following the camera's loss is documented in 2 sources: the ship's official data log, which records the scientific facts, and Lindgren's personal notes, which record the human ones. The data log shows that no further sonar contacts were detected after the camera deployment. It shows that the camera housing was recovered at 15:47 hours and the recording unit extracted. It shows that the tether cut was examined and photographed. It shows that the survey's planned transect schedule was suspended. What it does not show, what only Lindgren's notes preserve, is the conversation between Lindgren and Maltsev that took place that evening in the wardroom of the Akademik Lavrov, after the ship's company had been dismissed from the bridge. Maltsev had requested the meeting. Lindgren's notes record it in the form of a near-verbatim transcript, written from memory within an hour of its conclusion. Maltsev told Lindgren that he recognized the sonar profile from a classified file he had processed in 1984 during his service as a Soviet Navy acoustic analyst attached to the Northern Fleet's Signals Intelligence Section. The file, designated -83, described the recovery of a biological specimen from the Lena River near Yakutsk in November 1983. The specimen had been found frozen in river ice by a civilian barge crew. It was alive at the time of recovery. The physical description in the file, which Maltsev told Lindgren he had read in its entirety as part of his cataloging duties, matched what the sonar had tracked and the camera had filmed. The same proportions, the same locomotion, the same physical features that could not be reconciled with any known species. Maltsev told Lindgren that the -83 file had been ordered destroyed in 1991 during the Soviet collapse. He told Lindgren that the file's geographic designation referred not to Yakutsk, where the specimen was recovered, but to the Lena Delta, the exact coordinates where the Akademik Lavrov was now operating. And he told Lindgren something that Lindgren underlined twice in his notes. The survey mission's coordinates had been selected not by the Russian Academy of Sciences, but by a division of the Russian Navy that maintained continuity with the Soviet Northern Fleet's classified biological monitoring program. The survey was not routine. It had been sent to these specific coordinates because the Russian military had been monitoring this location since 1983. Lindgren's notes record his response. I asked him why he was telling me this. He said, because the Norwegians need to understand that this is not a scientific matter. He said, your institute will be asked to withdraw its report. You should not resist. He said, I am telling you because you are a scientist, and you deserve to know that what you recorded today is real, and that it has been documented before, and that no one who has documented it has been permitted to say so. Within 2 weeks of the Akademik Lavrov's return to port, the Russian Academy of Sciences classified the survey data, the sonar recordings, the camera footage, the data log entries from August 14th, under a provision that restricted access to senior Academy officials with security clearance. The Norwegian Polar Institute, which had co-funded the survey and received copies of the data, was contacted by the Russian co-sponsors and asked to withdraw its own preliminary report. The request came through diplomatic channels, not scientific ones, and it was accompanied by a communication from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, advising the Polar Institute to comply in the interest of maintaining productive bilateral research, cooperation in the Arctic. The Polar Institute withdrew its report. The preliminary visual analysis, the document that had described anterior appendages inconsistent with known morphology, that had noted uniformly dark eyes and a bifurcated terminal appendage, was rescinded. The copies of the sonar data and camera footage that had been transferred to the Polar Institute's servers were deleted at Russian request. The Norwegian scientists on the survey were asked to sign confidentiality agreements covering the data collected on August 14th. 3 of the 4 signed, Dr. Eric Lindgren did not. He did not refuse publicly. He simply did not return the signed document, and no one followed up. His private notes suggest this was deliberate. I will not sign because I do not believe a scientist should agree that evidence does not exist when he has seen it with his own eyes. But I will not speak publicly either, because Maltsev was right. This is not a scientific matter, and the consequences of disclosure are not scientific consequences. Lindgren never led another Arctic survey. His publication record, which had averaged 3 to 4 peer-reviewed papers per year for the preceding 2 decades, dropped to 1 paper in 1997, a study of sediment transport in the Barents Sea that he had completed, before the Lena Delta survey, and then to 0. He attended the Norwegian Polar Institute's annual research conference in February 1997, but gave no presentation and left before the final day. A colleague who spoke with him at the conference later told the Norwegian science journalist that Lindgren had seemed present but absent. He answered questions about his work with the same precision he always had, but he had no interest in discussing future projects, which was entirely unlike him. He retired from the Norwegian Polar Institute in 2001 at the age of 53, citing health reasons that his medical records, according to the journalist's 2019 investigation, do not substantiate. His colleagues at the Institute described the retirement as unexpected and uncharacteristic for a man who had shown no signs of physical decline or professional disengagement before August 1996. One colleague, who asked to remain anonymous in the journalist's report, said, "Eric did not slow down. He stopped." There is a difference. People who slow down lose interest gradually. Eric came back from the Lena survey and behaved as though the work no longer mattered, not because he was tired of it, but because something had made the work seem insufficient. In the years following his retirement, Lindgren maintained contact with only a handful of former colleagues. He did not attend conferences. He did not accept invitations to peer-review Arctic research papers. He spent his final years in Bergen, where neighbors described him as courteous but private, a man who walked along the harbor every morning, regardless of weather, and who kept a nautical chart of the Laptev Sea pinned to the wall of his study. A chart that his wife told the journalist had been there since 1996 and that Eric had never explained. The letter Lindgren wrote to his wife on the night of August 14th was never mailed. Its contents, preserved in his personal papers and accessed by the Norwegian journalist with the family's permission after Lindgren's death in 2018, include a passage that the journalist published, the only portion of the letter that has ever been made public. "I have spent 22 years measuring the ocean," Lindgren wrote. "I have believed, as a matter of professional faith, that the ocean is knowable, that with sufficient data, sufficient rigor, sufficient patience, everything in it can be cataloged and classified and understood. Today I watch something on a sonar screen and then on a camera feed that I cannot catalog. I cannot classify it. I do not understand it. And I am disturbed not by what it was, but by the fact that Maltsev, the Russian who has been watching the sonar since we left port, recognized it immediately. He has seen the file. He knows what it is. The Russians have known since 1983. They have known for 13 years, and they sent us to these coordinates to see if it was still here. It is still here." Sergei Maltsev gave one recorded interview in 2002 to a Russian investigative journalist working on a documentary about suppressed Soviet-era scientific files. The documentary was never completed. The interview recording survived in the journalist's personal archive and was transcribed in 2015. Maltsev confirmed that he had served as the Russian government's liaison officer aboard the Akademik Lavrov in 1996. He confirmed that the survey's coordinates had been selected based on classified information dating to 1983. He confirmed that he had recognized the sonar profile from the -83 file. And he described, in language that the transcript records as measured and deliberate, what he had told Lindgren that evening aboard the survey vessel. The file described a specimen recovered from Lena River ice near Yakutsk, he said. The barge captain's deposition was extraordinarily precise, the dimensions, the coloring, the physical structures. When I saw the sonar return in 1996, the proportions were consistent. The locomotion pattern was consistent. The depth preference was consistent. It was the same species, possibly the same individual. The interviewer asked Maltsev why the file had been coded to the Lena Delta rather than to Yakutsk. "Because the Navy understood something that the civilian ministry did not," Maltsev said. The Yakutsk incident was not a local event. The specimen was not a freshwater animal that happened to be in the river. The river was a corridor, a passage between the interior and the Arctic. The Navy had tracked anomalous sonar contacts at the Delta for years before the 1983 incident. They had never been able to identify the source. When the barge crew found the specimen in the ice 4,000 kilometers upstream, the Navy realized the corridor extended the full length of the Lena. The file was coded to the Delta because that was the end of the corridor that mattered, the end that connected to the ocean. The interviewer asked if the organism could still be alive. The 1983 specimen was frozen in river ice at -58 degrees and was alive when extracted, Maltsev said. A 1996 recording shows a form of the same species moving freely in water, barely above freezing. If this organism can survive being frozen solid in Siberian ice and can navigate a 4,000 kilometer, river system between freshwater and the Arctic Ocean, then the question of whether it is still alive misunderstands what we are dealing with. He paused. The question is not whether it survives. The question is how long it has been doing this. Maltsev died in 2009. The journalist who interviewed him confirmed in 2015 that the documentary was never completed because the production company lost its funding within weeks of this interview being recorded through what the journalist described as a series of administrative problems that, individually, were unremarkable, but that collectively made it impossible to continue. The sonar data and underwater footage from August 14, 1996, remain classified by the Russian Academy of Sciences. The Norwegian Polar Institute's withdrawn report has never been reinstated. The camera housing, recovered from the sea floor of the Laptev Sea with its recording unit intact, was transferred from the Akademik Lavrov to a Russian naval facility in Murmansk upon the vessel's return to port. Its current location is unknown. Two pieces of evidence from the 1996 survey remain outside government control. The first is Dr. Lindgren's personal letter to his wife, preserved in his papers and partially published in 2019. The second is the interview recording with Sergei Maltsev, preserved in a journalist's archive and transcribed in 2015. Between them, they describe an encounter that both the Russian and Norwegian governments have spent nearly 3 decades declining to acknowledge. What the evidence tells us, the evidence that survived the classification, the withdrawn reports, the unsigned confidentiality agreements, and the documentary that was never completed, is this. In November 1983, a Soviet barge crew on the Lena River found a living organism frozen in Siberian ice at -58 degrees Celsius, 4,000 kilometers from the sea. The organism had dark hair, gray-white skin, black eyes without iris or sclera, webbed hands with claws, and a lower body that tapered into a serpentine tail splitting into two. It was alive. It was watching them. 13 years later, at the precise coordinates coded into the classified file from that recovery, a joint research vessel recorded sonar data and underwater footage of a form, matching that description in every detail the technology could resolve, moving freely beneath Arctic ice, at the mouth of the same river, at the terminus of a corridor that stretches from the frozen heart of Siberia to the ocean. The Russian military had been monitoring those coordinates since 1983. They sent the survey to confirm what they already suspected. It confirmed it. And a man named Grigory Volkov, who had spent 24 years keeping his silence, because that was what you did in the Soviet Union when men without insignia arrived in the night. That man drew a map in his final years. 2 points on a river, a line between them, and a single word beneath it. Path. Wherever that path leads, from the frozen interior to the Arctic, and perhaps beyond, into waters we have not yet thought to search, the evidence suggests it is still in use. The Lena is still freezing every winter and thawing every spring. The delta is still draining into the Laptev Sea, and the coordinates in the -83 file, the coordinates that a ministry investigator dismissed as a clerical error and that the Russian Navy has been monitoring for over 4 decades, are still there, at the edge of the Arctic, at the mouth of the river, at the end of the path. If you have seen something in cold water that you could not explain, in a river, a lake, or waters that should not hold anything like what this evidence describes, we would like to hear about it. Leave your account in the comments below. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.